Hi, I'm Will LaVeist. He's Eric ClaVille. And you're tuned into LaVeist and ClaVille. We tell it to you straight the way it is from a black male's perspective, because it's like that. So let's get right to the show. The Tulsa Race Massacre, the 100th year anniversary of this tragedy that happened May 31 June through June 1st. And I pause because I'm just thinking about this anniversary that remains one of the worst incidences that of race violence in the U.S. in its history. And for a long time, it was one of the least known. And so now here we are, 100 years later, remembering, commemorating, and paying attention to this tragedy that has had long-lasting effects. And to just give you some idea, when it initially happened, the Oklahoma Bureau of Vital Statistics officially said and recorded that 36 people died. And it took several years to 2001 for a state commission to really examine the events and conclude and confirm that actually of the estimates of scholars of around 300 people is what actually happened. So now, 2001 Race Riot Commission report says that 100 and 300 people were killed and more than 8,000 people were made homeless over the 18 hours in 1921. And again, as we see analysis coming forth now, History Channel is actually having a feature on this. One of the things that's being brought out is how this incident, this massacre that happened 100 years ago, continues to have long-standing effects now in topics that we've been talking about on this show, like wealth building, trauma, continues to be in play even today, Eric.
Will, there's a lot to unpack, but first, before I do so, I want to mention their names. I want to say their names. Mm-hmm. Mrs. Viola Fletcher, 107 years old. Her younger brother, U.S. Army veteran, Hughes Van Ellis, 100 years old. And Miss Leslie Benningfield Randall, 106 years old, respectively. These are the three known survivors who witnessed this massacre firsthand. Well, nobody knows the mind of God. Nobody knows the complete plan of God.
Right.
But we may be able to say, in part, that God allowed these three to survive, to live over 100 years old, just in part so that they could put their eyewitness testimony on record forever.
Right, and verify.
In the halls of our government. After the years, after the days, after the hours, after the efforts to suppress this demonic, despicable, terrible acts of our citizens in our country against other citizens of their own city, you have to sit back and pause. You have to sit back and pause.
Well, when you say that, when you say that, you really go to the heart of what happened here. Because when you say citizens and our citizens, what you're finding is that it's at a time in this country when Black people still looked upon as being less than human and certainly not citizens at all, even coming out of slavery and coming out of the Civil War. And at this point, we're now in the World War I era where, in fact, you have Black people who have fought in every war in this nation's history.
Absolutely.
And we're coming back and fought in World War I.
Valiantly.
Soldiers, absolutely, and came back. And a big part of why this happened was because of Black people showing and proving that all of the lies that had been told already for generations since our people arrived at the shores in the 1600s and prior to that, all of those lies were being shown to be exactly that through what was happening at Black Wall Street in the community of Greenwood. Because what you had was African Americans who, despite all of the racism, despite all of the discrimination, despite living in a segregated city, were actually vibrant, had actually lifted themselves up through faith, through entrepreneurship, through education. They had a vibrant community. And then, like I said, they had soldiers who had come back from World War I who were contributing to the community, and they came back very much with a different sense of citizenship because they had gone and fought on behalf of the nation. So you had this vibrant community that was existing, totally putting to shame the lie of Black inferiority. And this was very much at the root of what kicked off the massacre, because there's a very familiar theme here about what sparked the incident. You had a Black man,
yes,
supposedly
right,
inappropriately engaging with a white woman, which eventually was found to be totally unfounded.
Yeah,
that happened. And so talk about that. Talk about it, Eric. Talk about what happened.
So, Will, to your point, I want to explain what Greenwood was. Greenwood was a district located in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was located on Greenwood Avenue. And this area of Greenwood was a thriving business district known as Black Wall Street. This is where African Americans, during the time of Jim Crow, by the way, I want to point that out, during the time of Jim Crow and segregation, immediately after the World War I, and 1 year post the last world pandemic of the 1918-1920 flu pandemic.
Right.
So I want us to look at this in global.
Right. Enough, and still not far outside of the Civil War, you know?
Absolutely. Come on. I mean, look at this in global, right? Look at all of the social, economic, war, and health issues that are existing, not just in that area, in the country, but in the world. Mm-hmm. But yet and still. Because it was thriving so much, they called it Wall Street. And we know what happens on Wall Street. Money never sleeps.
Right.
That means there was so much business going on. Blacks were prosperous in spite of what I just mentioned. Now, what started this, the massacre began during Memorial Day weekend, all right? It was after a 19-year-old, his name was Dick Rowland. He was a shoe shiner. He was accused of assaulting a white female who was 17 on an elevator. Well, 17-year-old she was an elevator operator at the nearby building.
Right, she screams, he leaves, so all of a sudden the assumption is he had to
the assumption, exactly, the assumption.
Have done something inappropriate.
I mean, we've seen this, right? Let's look at modern history. Central Park 5.
That's right.
Let's go back to the U.S. Supreme Court case, which laid so many landmark legal principles, created landmark legal principles. The Scottsboro Boys, 19,
Scottsboro Boys.
Young men who were accused of the same thing. Okay.
And of course, Emmett Till, of course.
Emmett Till. Let's look at the most egregious act of violence upon a boy who whistled. Okay. Whistled. Mm. So what happens is they take Mr. Rowland, who's a shoe shiner, into custody. After the arrest, rumors spread through the city, we're going to lynch him. Now, this was also at the height of lynching because it was after the Civil War, after slavery, but during the time of sharecropping, and then during the time of Jim Crow, where lynchings reached a very high level. And again, lynchings came out of basically putting Black men and women, a lot of women were lynched, putting Black men mostly back in subjection as they were in slavery. If you take a look at a lot of those lynchings, where Billie Holiday called strange fruit hanging from trees, necks elongated, bodies where the ropes are decapitating the heads of Black bodies, where their bodies are rotting, where they're becoming bloated, where their bodies are then becoming just cut up and just completely treated inhumanely. Okay, but with all of that, Will, in those historical pictures, you see white citizens in their Sunday's best. Keep in mind, this was a time period where people didn't dress up because they only had one, maybe two pairs of dress clothing or overalls because we were still in an agricultural society. But they were in a Sunday's best, standing under this tree where a Black man or woman is being was lynched, and they're with their children, smiling,
taking pictures, essentially taking that generation's version of the selfie.
There you go.
Proud of what they're doing.
So, Will, take all of that knowledge, take all of that history that we just discussed, wrap that up into the anger now that boils up, because we know what happens with mob mentality, right? Mob mentality, where someone throws something, everybody's going to pick up and throw something. Someone says something, everyone's going to say the same thing.
Right.
Someone in that crowd mentioned Black Wall Street. Those Blacks, or whatever derogatory words they would say, think they're somebody. They have more money than us, good white folks. And they went down there, and according to Mrs. Viola Fletcher, who was 7 years old, she said every day of her life for the last 100 years, she hears the screams.
Wow.
She see the Black bodies in the street. She see men being pulled from their houses, shot and killed. She see white men from the white mob burning down businesses and houses. She said history may have forgotten. She said, but she could not forget because she hears it and relives it every single day. Over 300 so far. All right, trust me, we believe there is more, much more, but over 300 so far were murdered. All property destroyed. Not one piece of property was left undamaged. Over 10,000 were homeless, and not one, and they were buried in a mass grave. The survivors were kept under gun point while they put them in the mass grave. They dared anyone to say anything about it, or they would meet that same end. Not one business, not one family, not one generation was compensated for the loss of their business, which was in her mind, in which she said it was her ability in order to have the American dream. It was taken away from her.
Right.
That's what it's all about.
And, and the thing about it is that you can see the pattern of how these incidents happen and then how they spread. So, for example, you talked about rumors circulating. Well, the front page of the Tulsa Tribune, like newspaper, right? You see how the media spreads this information. It's reported that police had arrested Rowland for sexually assaulting the woman, right? So what happens is now you've got the justification for what you already want to do, because what you talked about pointed out is so significant, that what was really going on here is that there were folks who wanted to burn down Black Wall Street before this incident happened anyway.
Absolutely.
So now this becomes the catalyst, this becomes the justification. So you see the role of the media, right? Spreading the fake news, spreading the rumors. Then you get people gathering around and justifying, their behavior and what they want to do. And in those times, you have very much angry mob mentality, as you talked about, the lynch mobs, vigilanteism that goes on. So when you read about this and when you see the footage, it easily starts to bring to mind, unless you just want to totally be in denial, how can you not begin to see the mentality of what happened here in the nation January 6th.
Yeah.
You know, the insurrection, the run on the Capitol building, because what happened here, there was actually a run on the National Guard Armory.
Yeah.
So you see, the media fuels it. It becomes this breakdown, this anarchy, this belief that we are above the law, we are above the government, and in fact, we can do what we want, and the government will actually support in what we were doing. So what the accounts actually show is that a lot of whites were actually deputized, right? So they were sanctioned to do what many people actually already wanted to do, which was to destroy the community. And so it just brings to mind how you see these patterns, you see how it develops. And then unless you just totally want to be in denial about living in this country, how can you not see the similarities to the issues and the things that we face today? Something happens, people make assumptions, the media goes and chases it, and now we have social media, right? Where there's even less context of what is actually going on and what actually happened that fuels, the hysteria.
Can we actually call it media then? I mean, that's a discussion for another day.
These are the times that we're in, but what it's teaching us is that the undercurrent of racism continues to be prevalent
Absolutely.
in the nation and is always there, ready to be brought up, ready to be stirred up. And if we don't address it, we will continue to have these kinds of, this kind of unrest, this kind of madness, this kind of hysteria.
But we'll also want to point out that this was not just an isolated incident. I mentioned, of course, the Scottsboro boys, the Supreme Court case that took place. But we have another anniversary coming up, January 1st through the 7th, 1923. A very similar accusation, which was unfounded. Another self-sufficient town where African Americans owned property. African Americans basically were able to own and create the jobs, and they were self-sustaining. And that's the city of Rosewood, Florida, right. Which, of course, a movie was created and brought attention to it. But it didn't really get the momentum about social justice and the injustice of that time. The exact same thing happened. There was a black drifter who was accused of assaulting a white woman. And what ended up happening is they ended up killing almost 30 people. Now, the course is reported maybe 6 at the time, but people believe it's much higher. But whites and blacks were killed. All right, so they fought back. But we're talking 1923. Tulsa was 1921. We're talking 2.5 years. Distance from these two events. So we see now, Will, that what took place and what was in the minds and the hearts of the people in Tulsa was not an isolated incident. It was in the minds and the hearts of white Americans across the country. If we're looking at history and telling the truth about it and not trying to re-explain history, we're going to talk about that in another segment. So 100 years later, Tulsa Massacre, not one apology, not one dime, I'm going to even go a little further, not one penny of compensation. Finally, the truth is coming out. They're using high-definition technology for searches of mass graves, which they think they found one by the banks of the river. And to this day, there was a bill put forth in the Oklahoma legislature to include this in Oklahoma history.
Right.
Will, what do you think happened?
Well, I'll let you tell it. Shocked me to say that it actually did pass when I know that it did.
The bill failed. The bill failed. The Oklahoma legislature did not want this history taught in schools. Let's just digest that for a couple of seconds. the national news, the congressional testimony, the truth about what truly happened, the lies pulled up by probably microfiche now from the newspapers of that time, exposed, all of these aspects in the reckoning with social injustice, all these aspects of our history. And still, you have a legislative body that denies it. Why is that?
Well, they would say that, one of the things that they did say was that the schools, students are already teaching, about the riot, that it wasn't necessary. It is part of the curriculum. There are history classes. But clearly, this not going forth and really making it a pivotal point in history is a part of the movement to really not fully come to grips with this type of history, these types of incidences that have happened, throughout the country. So there's this resistance, like you said, we're going to talk about it more. We see that still very much at play now. There's this resistance to really go back and be honest about what has happened. And quite frankly, it's really important to connect these dots, because the first thing that people will say is that was then. People living now, children now, were not a part of that happened. Times have changed. But the thing that's really important to understand about this is how the ability to build wealth was so destroyed by, for example, by this incident. Like, for example, is one of the articles I read. We talked about the black press at the time, the black newspaper at the time, the family that owned it. Paper was burnt down. And so imagine if that family, prosperous media company, and you fast forward to now, what that company potentially could have been. Maybe that could have been Johnson Publishing or BET or CNN or Time Warner. So what you've had that has been lost is so many businesses and so many opportunities to build wealth, so many opportunities for land to appreciate in its value and be passed down to next generations, is something that has been lost. And these are the types of things and why it's important to teach this topic, to teach about what has happened and how people continue to be impacted today. We've got to teach and connect the dots. And unfortunately, I've been a proponent. You heard me talk about this on radio and on shows many times about how we really need a deep dive in this country to do honest anti-racism education, not for the purpose of making some people feel bad and others feel better about themselves,
right,
but for the purpose of really understanding the systems and understanding the behaviors and the policies and how they really affect people's lives in real, concrete ways. And unless we really understand that, unless we really do that in the education systems, do that, you can't expect it to bleed into the homes. It's the education systems and the churches are two of the key places where it really has to be done if you're going to make a difference in society.
So, Will, what's the solution? And today, as it relates to Tulsa, Oklahoma, because a lot of times when we go to African American communities, and Tulsa, Greenwood district is no different, we see MLK Boulevard. The only positive thing about a lot of MLK Boulevards is the name is on there.
His name, MLK Boulevard, yeah.
Right. A lot of times we see dilapidation, we see abandoned buildings, we see a lot of poverty, and which is the exact opposite of what King was fighting for. Mm-hmm. And he actually was fighting for economic upward mobility prior to his death.
Right.
So, Greenwood is no different. There's also, a history where it looks at how it was rebuilt, but then in the 70s, but it's being taken away due to gentrification.
Right, urban renewal, yeah.
Right, which is gentrification, all right? So with that being the case, I mean, we probably have not seen African-American communities like Greenwood, like Rosewood, and like other small towns, some in the north. You got in Michigan, you got a group of African-American Black blueberry farmers that own massive amounts of land that grow blueberries. I mean, these are people who basically found freedom, their forefathers, and they stayed on that land and they still farm that land. A lot of Black farmers who actually got a lot of help in this last stimulus and got noticed for their discrimination. So there's a lot of African-American communities, pockets now of African-American, I should say that are prospering and have the American dream. However, African-American communities with a business district like Black Wall Street and others that existed during that time period, we have not seen those in decades. I remember an area in my city where you saw Black businesses. I lived in one of those neighborhoods.
Right.
But my children, I can't take them to that right now, right? Now, there are parts of cities that went through urban renewal, but it's what's called mixed use, right? The African-American business persons don't really own a lot of that property, but they're not the majority owners in that district.
Yeah, I think it depends. Like you said, I think it depends on where you're at in the country. I mean, I know in the D.C., DMV, Maryland area, you will see opportunities of Black prosperity and, like you said, areas where you have Black businesses and doing well. I think the solution is very much, it's not a simple do one, not the other solution. We need policy. We need laws. We need, moral uplift. But I think we absolutely need a keen focus on economic development and entrepreneurship. Absolutely. I think that is the model of what Tulsa, Black Wall Street, Greenwood taught us. And it continues to teach us is that, look, we've got to develop businesses. And where we're at through all the pain and sorrow that has happened, we still have access to the broader economic system, which is even an international system now that we did not have at those times. Like, for example, it wasn't as easy. It wasn't even imaginable for some people to say, I'm just going to buy stock in this company or that company. So we have access to the economic system. It's not perfect access. It's by no means, there's still significant barriers. Right. But we have access that we did not have previously. And so we need to take advantage of that access. So we need to view ourselves, for example, as looking at something as simple as the type of cell phone that you use. And saying, if I'm spending money on this cell phone carrier, don't you think I should also be owning stock in this cell phone carrier? I mean, you had the ability to do that. That did not exist, in 1921, to be able to do something like that as a Black person. We had the ability to buy homes in a lot of areas that were absolutely, whether you had the resources or not, that were blocked off it. So we had the ability to not only just buy homes that we live in, we had the ability to purchase homes and to use those as rental properties that provide housing for other people and secondary income to build wealth. So I think we've got to look at how can we go forward to our best selves instead of looking back and saying we want to go back to the way something was. We need to look back at the lessons and go forward to the way we can be better, because we have access because of that kind of pain and the suffering that has happened to our forefathers before us. We have access at this time that we didn't have before. And this pandemic has created some resets. This pandemic, in all of its pain, there's always in a pain, there's an opportunity, there's a promise coming if you take advantage of it. And so this pandemic has created some resets in a number of different areas that if people look carefully and position themselves, you can get in and you can gain an advantage and build wealth for your family and the community in which you live.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Will, I want to give before we end, I definitely want to give some information about that piece that I mentioned in Oklahoma legislature Remember, on LaVeist and ClaVille, we like to give you facts and we like to clarify it in case there's an issue. But in 2020, a Senate bill passed requiring teaching of the Tulsa race history by Senator Julie Eason McIntyre and also Representative Jamar Shumate. Now, the opposition to that, it went to the House chamber, but the opposition to it is that it's already in the history books. Mm-hmm. But the key to that bill is that it's not required to be taught. It's optional, and most teachers don't teach it. So that bill went there for it to require that it be taught, okay? So school districts had to ensure the information was presented in high school courses in U.S. history or Oklahoma history. And the measure would become effective, and that did July 1st of that particular year, back in 2020.
Excellent. That's good facts. That's good facts.
So I wanted to, and that was that particular information I read was updated August 2020. You can go to tulsaworld.com. It talks about it, but that article showed up in March of 2012, which that bill would have become effective that July 1st of that day. So I wanted to go back and make sure that our listeners heard that information and that they saw it, and ensure that they have the information to make sure they know what the information is out there. So you can also track that bill in the Oklahoma legislature as well. So I want to end, as we close this session, because it's a very good session. We can talk about this for hours. I want to end with really discussing what's reparations. You know, we've talked about reparations. What can we offer a family, siblings that's 107 and 100 years old, and someone else who's 106? What can we offer them now? And what can we offer those generations that lost everything at the hands of mob violence?
What, you're asking me? What you want me to say? What we can offer them now?
Yeah.
I mean, I think you got to ask them. I mean, they've got to be able to say what it is they want. I would imagine that what someone who's, a centenarian would want opportunity, liberty for their grandchildren, for their descendants. I think they have seen so much and been through so much that they don't want to see another generation of their people having to go through what they've gone through. So I would imagine that the things that we've talked about, that those are the kinds of things that they would want to see, that we be able to have life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And I think, as we were talking about it, economic development, like what Black Wall Street represents, is really what we need to go back so that we can go forward too.
Absolutely. Well, with that, I want to thank you again for taking time out of your schedule to listen to LaVeist and ClaVille, where we bring it to you straight, just like it is. Feel free. Follow us on our social media. Like, share, follow on our Facebook page, all of the social media as well. If you have any questions, please comment. Let us know what you think about this session and others. Until next time, according to LaVeist and ClaVille, that's the way it is. We'll see you.